Bueno, muy bien. Estamos listos para arrancar. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Antes que nada, bienvenidos a Eseade. Me encanta que haya gente aquí, que haya mucha gente y que estén curiosos de conocer y de disfrutar el saber de una persona muy experta, sobre todo a esta altura del año, ¿no? Que ya está todo cerrando, que hace un calor de morirse y uno está pensando más en qué va a comer el 24 de la noche que en leer o escuchar charlas, ¿no? Así que la verdad, genial por eso. Yo le voy a gritar solamente unos brevísimos minutos, realmente soy breve, para decirles que este evento está hecho en conjunto entre el Ayn Rand Center y Eseade, y particularmente la maestría en Economía y Ciencias Políticas de Eseade, que es un programa de maestría que dirijo yo, Iván Carrino, por si no me conocían, perdónenme, mi nombre es Iván Carrino, con Adrián Rabier. Dirigimos este programa que tiene muchos años en Eseade, del cual he sido profesor varios años, continúo siéndolo, y es una... O sea, nosotros decimos que formamos economistas, pero de una manera integral. Había un famoso economista norteamericano llamado Murray Rothbard, ahí a Capral le va a gustar esta referencia, que decía algo así como que la persona que se dedica a la economía no le interesa pasar su vida haciendo segundas o terceras derivadas, ¿no? O sea, que se interesó en la economía porque miraba a su alrededor y decía, acá las cosas andan mal. Esto me preocupa, esto no me gusta, acá hay pobreza, acá hay marginalidad, acá hay exclusión. Y entonces que el economista quiere resolver eso en el fondo. Vos preguntale a todo el tipo que estudie economía, económicas, qué lo motivó y muy probablemente te vas a encontrar con eso. Sin ir más lejos, uno escucha, digamos, para ir a la coyuntura, al ministro Martín Guzmán y él dice, yo me metí a estudiar economía en plena crisis de 2001. Y si vos me preguntás a mí, que yo empecé a estudiar en el 2003, en el 2004... Lo mismo, a mí me había pegado lo mismo. La situación de la crisis del 2001 marcó a toda la nueva generación de economistas. Volviendo, digamos, Rothbard decía, no te interesa eso. El economista, entonces el economista no es una persona que estudia matemáticas nada más. El economista que se precie de serlo tiene que ser formado en ciencias económicas, pero también en historia, ¿sí? En política y en filosofía. Bueno, eso es lo que hacemos en Eseade. O sea, la maestría en Economía y Ciencias Políticas es una maestría donde la mitad es un programa de económicas, pero la otra mitad tiene epistemología, filosofía y obviamente mucho de ciencia política. Así que para la maestría es un placer tener hoy, y no me voy a extender mucho en la presentación del orador, pero es un placer tener a Stephen Hicks, filósofo, profesor de filosofía en la Oxford University de Chicago, canadiense, y que tenemos la suerte de que nos visite a menudo en el país, autor de muchos libros, y bueno, una mente brillante, contemporánea, que podemos disfrutar en vivo hoy, y para todos los que vean esto en YouTube, lo pueden ver en YouTube también. Así que bueno, gracias a todos por estar, gracias Steven por tu presencia, les pido a todos perdón, porque ya le pedí a Steven perdón de antemano, que me voy a tener que ir más o menos a las 8 menos 10 de la noche, así que ya están avisados, no es que me parece fea la presentación para nada. Y bueno, María, como titular del Ayn Rand Center, gracias a vos y te dejo la palabra y te doy el micrófono para que quede ya. Muchas gracias.
Hola, ¿se escucha bien? ¿Sí? Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. De vuelta, tiene razón Iván, muchísimas gracias por venir un 19 de diciembre. Eso dice que les gusta mucho el arte o ya se quedaron, digamos, ya no tienen más trabajo, diciembre, están relajados y dijeron vamos a escuchar algo diferente. ¿Todos hablan y entienden más o menos bien inglés? Sí, bueno, Stephen de todas maneras tiene un inglés muy claro por ser canadiense y hay muchas fotos y muchas láminas, así que estamos seguros que van a entender mucho. Yo soy el presidente del Ayn Rand Center Latinoamérica, básicamente es un centro que comenzó este año en el 2019 con el objetivo de promover las ideas de Ayn Rand. ¿Quién de los que están acá presentes ha escuchado hablar de Ayn Rand? Bueno, bastante bien, muy bien. Si no, ahí también tienen unos cuantos libros si quieren después mirar un poquito. Pero básicamente las ideas de Rand tienen una filosofía detrás que es la llamada objetivismo. Bueno, obviamente toda filosofía tiene sus ramas. Una de sus ramas es el arte, que es una de las ramas que muchas veces más disfrutamos, pero nos cuesta mucho entender. Hace unos años atrás tuve la suerte de tener un libro de Stephen Hicks que se llama Explicando el Postmodernismo, que aquí también está, ya lo tenemos aquí en español, y en el anexo final había justamente un artículo, un ensayo llamado ¿Porqué el arte se volvió feo? Y realmente fue una especie me trajo una claridad y una explicación muy clara de cómo la filosofía realmente influencia el arte, la influencia que todos los artistas tienen de la filosofía y las ideas del momento en que el artista ha generado ese arte. Luego de eso también tuve la suerte de escuchar una charla de él en Miami, que va a ser un poquito, hoy vamos a presenciar una charla muy similar a esa, pues yo le pedí especialmente, repetí esa charla porque realmente es brillante cómo explica la secuencia de ideas y arte y cómo uno va entendiendo un poco qué había detrás de cada época artística. Así que sin mucho más para introducir, Steven, como bien dijo Iván, es profesor de la Universidad de Rockford, es PhD en filosofía, es autor de varios libros, entre ellos Explicando el Postmodernismo, desde Rousseau hasta Foucault, y Nietzsche and the Nazis, que los dos están aquí en español, por si después les interesa también llevárselos. Muchas gracias, Steven. I don't know if you understand anything of what I said.
Mucho.
Mucho? Okay. So speak slowly and just enjoy. So please, un aplauso de bienvenida para Steven.
Okay, I'm going to be speaking about the art world for the last 120 years. Now, human beings have been doing art and enjoying art for tens of thousands of years. There's something that is deeply human about engagement with art. But if you know art history, the last century, 100 years, has been the most unusual century in the world of art. And for most of us who love art or who are interested in art, who have some engagement, and that's all of us, right? We encounter what is going on in the modern art world, the postmodern art world, and most of us initially are confused, we are bewildered, sometimes we are disgusted, we don't understand, we shake our heads. And so one of the questions I'm going to ask today is, why did the art world become so unusual over the course of the last 100 years? And there are reasons for it. Behind the apparent nonsense, there is sense, right? But it's not necessarily a sense that fits with your understanding of what is sensible and so forth. Now, I'm a philosopher by training and by profession, and one of the reasons why art has changed so dramatically is philosophical. And I want to argue today that the most important reason why art made its major change, 1890s, 1900s, the generation before the First World War, was a series of revolutions that had occurred in the philosophical world. And artists, even if they're not philosophers by training, are nonetheless very philosophical. When we do art and when we experience art, we are always asking ourselves, what really matters? And that's a value question. And you have to go deep in yourself, and all artists will talk about going deep in themselves. Who am I? What do I want to express? What do I want when I communicate with other people? What do I want them to experience? And if I want them to spend money, $1,000, $10,000, what is going to be so valuable to them that I can add value, whatever that value is, to their life? And how do I know that I have succeeded? And we know when we experience art, it affects us profoundly. And we decorate our homes with art, we spend money on art, we spend time, and most of us at some point entertain some aspirations of being creative. I will do poetry, I will write a novel, I would like to do scripts, I would like to try painting. So what is going on there? and what has happened in the last century of the art world. Now, there's a follow-up question that I want to address, and that is, one thing that has been characteristic of art history is the rapidity with which the art world changes. Different styles, different motifs, different genres. And so if you take a course on the history of art, particularly once you get into the last 1,000 years, there are so many different movements and changes and dramatic breaks in style. And one very interesting thing about the last century is how little has changed. That it's the same sorts of themes, the same territory that is being worked over and over and over again. And we are 4 generations, 5 generations into it. Why has the art world not moved on? Why is there not another new radical break to another movement and so forth? It seems stuck. And the reason I'm going to offer is that, again, philosophy is important. That at the turn of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, there was a philosophical framework that was broadly adopted. And it was a very skeptical, cynical, in some cases nihilistic understanding of the world. And that was picked up by the artists and communicated, and it required some fairly dramatic changes in how you do art if you have a very skeptical, nihilistic, value-empty understanding of the world. And not much has changed in terms of the guiding philosophy of the contemporary high art world. So that's going to be my thesis, and for the rest of the time I'm going to start working my way through that. So, art is very personal. At the same time, it is very universal, and that's one of the interesting things about art. So if we read the story of Romeo and Juliet, for example, we all know this story, and we get into the story and we start to care about Romeo. We care about Juliet. They are particular individuals and they matter to us. But at the same time, they are abstract types. It's the young man and the young woman, and it's love. And that's a human universal. And in this case, there's a family dynamic. The families hate each other, and there are obstacles. And that also is a universal. And of course, this one ends tragically, and that's another universal. But because we care about Romeo and Juliet as individuals, it affects us, both personally and universally. It's not just a sad story about 2 individuals. It is a sad story about 2 individuals, but we also take it as saying something more generally important about the human condition. And that's why every generation we go back to Romeo and Juliet. And here we are 500 years later, and we all know, actually not quite 500 years later, but we all know the Romeo and Juliet story. So, this is a painting by Vermeer, okay? And in one sense, this is a particular young woman, and she's rather lovely, and it's a lovely blue and gold, and that's a beautiful contrast, but there's also something that we respond to, that combination. We have this look in her eye. As it turns out, this young woman is probably Vermeer's daughter. And so for him, she, this particular young woman, is very important. And so he's trying to communicate something about that. But why do we respond to this painting 400 years later? We don't know Vermeer's daughter, and we don't care about her, but this is a lovely young woman. And there's something that is captured here, and we value young femininity, and she's taken some care to dress a certain way, and of course, the centerpiece, the lovely earring. So it's a particular young woman, but it's also general femininity, and we evaluate both. It's an ancient piece. This is at the Vatican, and the scale of this is stupendous. I don't know if you've seen it right in person, larger right than life. This is Laocoon, and at one level, it's a particular story. Laocoon was a Trojan. He was a priest, and he got on the wrong side of the gods, and then the gods do what the gods do. When people get on the wrong side of them, they send punishment. And so there's a particular story about a Trojan priest and his sons, and they are killed. But then at the same time, we respond to this piece 2,000 years later, even if we don't know it's a Trojan priest or the particular background. It's a human being, and we have various nasty forces of nature that are out there waiting to get us. It's, again, a tragic, a horrific death piece, and we respond to it. We feel his pain. And so it's mankind against nature, and nature is often hostile and trying to kill us. And that is, again, a human universal. So it's a particular and it's a universal. Hey, guys. Okay. Now, these decisions, right, about what matters to us. And art is unusual because it does have these broad philosophical messages, but it captures them in particularized form. It's not just a journalistic account, but it's not an abstract philosophical statement. It is a capture. And so over the course of the history of art, because of the power of art, we have these very deep, ongoing philosophical debates about art. So if I'm an artist, the biggest question I always have to answer is, well, what am I going to portray? And one of the ongoing debates is, am I open to the entire world? And art should be about all of reality and trying to capture all of reality. Or is it the case that art should only be about portions of reality, that some parts of the world are off limits? And so, for example, we might say, as this passage here from Exodus says, "Thou shalt not make thee any graven images." Now that's archaic English, so let me translate it into modern Englishes, right? You cannot make representations in art. You cannot do figures. And this is now a divine commandment, because the natural human impulse is to make representations and figures and to capture the way the world is. If you are interested in religion, you want to know about God or the gods, and you want to find in your art, because the gods are important, how to capture the gods and the supernatural and the divine in your artworks. And then this says, no, you shall not do it. And though that then is to say that the most important part of reality, if you are religious, is not to be captured in art. And then at the same time, from this religious perspective, you might have the view that this natural world, the physical world, is not very important. It's a lower world. You're only here for a few years, and then you die, and your soul separates from your body, and you go on to your eternal life, and that is what you should be thinking of and focusing on. But put those two together. If you are not allowed to do representations and figures about the supernatural and the divine, and at the same time you're not supposed to be very interested in the lower physical world, you should be only contemplating the higher spiritual world, then there's no room for art. Art is almost banished. And this is a philosophical position. And what is very interesting in art history is those religious traditions that have taken this pronouncement seriously have not generated traditions in painting, traditions in sculpture, traditions in theater, and so forth. So that's a metaphysical debate. What should artists be allowed to represent? The entire world and engage with it, or portions of it? Now, what's the reason for this prohibition here? And again, there's a philosophical reason. The argument is that the spiritual world, God cannot be represented because he is a purely spiritual being, and the physical is low, it's base, it's in many cases disgusting. So if you try to take something that is pure and high and beautiful, the gods, and capture them in physical form, that is blasphemy. That is a degradation, and you shouldn't do that. So again, before we can be an artist, we have to make some religious and philosophical decisions about what our subject matter is going to be. Now, we're interested also not necessarily in the world out there and the gods or God, we're also interested in ourselves. Well, who are we? What is it to be a human being? And then we look at those Greek statues, and what we see is human beings are beautiful, powerful, erotic, right? noble, dignified. And when the Greeks are portraying the gods, right, and they have, of course, many gods, they are portraying them in human form, like the gods are just really awesome human beings. And we get the sense that we as human beings are pretty special ourselves, and if we work on ourselves, we can become almost godlike. And how wonderful is that? And that is a very powerful philosophical assessment about what it is to be a human being. But at the same time, we know there are many who will make the judgment about human beings that they are sinful, that they are weak, that they are hypocrites, they're disgusting, right? They engage in all sorts of betrayals, and they know what is good, but they do not do what is good, and so they should feel ashamed of themselves, they should feel guilty, and they should fall to their knees and press their faces into the dirt and ask for forgiveness. Now, if you were an artist and you were going to portray what it is to be a human being, right, you were going to go in very different directions, right? The Greek direction versus the human beings are shameful and should cower and fall down. And what about politics? Should we, in our art, say anybody can be represented? We're interested in all human beings from all walks of life. Or since we know that art is so powerful, is art something that should be politically controlled? And only artists who are doing representations perhaps of kings or aristocrats or generals who have accomplished something, maybe Olympic athletes who are doing something very special. But only art, because of its importance, is allowed to do special human beings. And people who are not worthy, those should not be the proper subject matter of art. So, do we believe that art should be free and accessible to all human beings, that we should be interested in the full range of human experience, or is art politically something that should be controlled and reserved for those whom the political leadership considers to be important? And then the subject matters. What do we think about sex? What do we think about race? What do we think about power and justice? The whole range of values. Do we let artists express anything they want? Or do we say some viewpoints are morally wrong and they should not be allowed to be expressed? So the point of all of this is now we're raising questions about metaphysics and the nature of reality, what it is to be a human being. What are the important values? Should people be free or controlled? Should we be egalitarian or elitist? And all of those philosophical questions have great bearing on how artists. So to be an artist, you have to engage with those questions, and that's part of the power of art. And it also explains why in art history, art has gone through various cycles of engagement and disengagement, higher aspirations and lower aspirations, depending on what the prevailing philosophy of the era has been. Now, that said, I want to jump to our era, right? And I want to bracket it by the year 1917 because it was about a century ago, so it's the mathematics is almost perfect, right? Because we're 2019 now. But three things happened in 1917 that are indicative of the time period and what has changed or not changed since 1917. So I want to give you the first one. Here's the first one. All right. I could do this as an art history test, right? Whose work is this? So this is Marcel Duchamp. This is a work called Fountain, and it was exhibited in New York in 1917. New York had just recently become the new center of the art world. And so one of the interesting things, we'll come back to this, is that if you go to the 1400s, it was Italy. By the time you get to the 15 and 1600s, it's moving to Amsterdam and the Low Countries in Holland. And then into the 1700s, it's London, and 1800s, it's Paris, and then by the time we get to the 1900s, it's the United States, New York, Hollywood, and so forth. So this is a statement, what's going on in New York in 1917. Now, Duchamp is an artist. This is, well, you recognize what this is, right? Well, not really. Well, maybe. But yes, he went to a hardware store, bought a urinal, took it back. He put this R. Mutt, he just wrote that on there, sent it in, of course, the date, 1917, and this is his statement about art. Now, why this matters? Because if you go 1 century later, we're now into the 2000s, and there's a survey done of British and American artists, over 1,000 of them, asking them to name the most important, influential artist on their thinking and development as an artist. Now, we would come up with all sorts of names, right? We might say Andy Warhol, we might say Pablo Picasso, and those guys came in second and third. Number 1 most important artist of the 20th century, according to leading 20th century artists, was this guy, Marcel Duchamp. And that's interesting. So what is going on with this, such that not only is it part of the art world, but it is judged by those inside the art world as the most important piece of art of the past century. And it is still with them. 1917, also in Michigan, in Dearborn, the brand new high-tech Ford Motor Company mass production automobile plant opened. And it is, of course, a marvel of modern engineering, right? The number of cars that can be produced, the cost of those cars, the quality of those cars, and of course Ford is a household name. So in 1917, there are those who are saying this is amazing, awesome, what the modern world is able to do. Henry Ford is a hero of the business and engineering world. But the reaction in the art world was negative, consistently negative, still in France, in England, and in the United States. So I've got one representative quotation here, Alfred Stieglitz, speaking for the artistic community in the early 20s. Every time I see a Ford car, something in me revolts. So he looks at that and he says, that's disgusting. That's repulsive. I hate where the modern world is going. So what's going on there? Well, we can say, well, this is a mass production facility, and everything is broken down. And here we have human beings, but the machine is going along, and the human beings have to keep up with the machine. And the new part comes along, I have to do what the boss told me to do, what the machine is making me do. And so the modern world, with its engineering and its business achievements and the entrepreneurship that is built into this, is then seen not as a progressive force, but as something that is dehumanizing us. It amounts to a threat, an attack on what it is to be a human being. And so a huge part of the artistic movement is then a reaction against industrialization, against mechanization, against businessmen like Henry Ford who can make $1 million. So that's also 1970. And then also 1917, the Russian Revolution. It's a bit of a cliche. Of course, artists have always been engaged with politics. It's always there. But one of the very interesting things about the last 100 years is how much politics is front and center in much of the art world. So it's not just that art is about family life and religion and nature and human beings and sex and politics too, right? For much of the 20th century, politics has come to be the most important aspect, and for many artists and sub-movements within modernism and postmodernism, it is explicitly and almost exclusively a political exercise. And of course, the portion of the political spectrum, I don't know how you divide the political spectrum, right, or if you need multiple spectra, but the portions of the political spectrum that are most dominant within the art world for the last century is relatively narrow. It's a small portion of the political spectrum that has been dominant. So let's ask why. Now, I want to give you some quotations. That was 1917. And what you might expect is, the way art goes, is that for 20 years, 30 years, maybe 40 years, there's this new artistic movement, new approach arises. It dominates for a while, but then people get bored, they get tired, they want something new. And the artists themselves get bored and tired, and they say, oh, we've already seen that many times. I want to do something new and fresh and original. So by the time we get to the 1960s, that's already then been 40 years or 50 years of a certain approach to art. And we see certain themes starting to be repeated over and over again. So let me give you a series of commentators. This is 50 years ago. I'll start with one from the Russian-born novelist Ayn Rand, speaking about what has happened in the modern art world. Quote, when modern artists declare that they don't know what they are doing or what makes them do it, we should take them at their word and give them no further consideration. Now notice that that's 50 years ago, and we have a perceptive person working inside the art and literature world saying, okay, we've listened, we've given you your chance, you're saying you don't know what you're doing, and you've been doing it for 40 years, let's stop listening to these artists anymore and go and do something different. 50 years ago. 40 years ago, the Mexican poet and Nobel Prize winner Octavio Paz. Today, modern art is beginning to lose its powers of negation. So modern art was about negation, critique, and so forth, but it's losing its powers. Why? Well, because we've just been hearing the same thing over and over again, right? For some years now, its rejections have been ritual repetitions. So pausing, ritual, you're just going through the motion, it's the same thing over and over again. Rebellion has turned into procedure, criticism into rhetoric, etc. Negation is no longer creative. Pause right there. What an insult to artists to say that what you are doing is no longer creative. It's like the worst possible insult you can give to an artist. I'm not saying that we are living the end of art. We are living the end of the idea of modern art. So 40 years ago, modern art was over, according to Octavio Paz. 30 years ago, Egyptian-born literary critic Ihab Hassan. The postmodern period is driven repetitively by a vast will to unmaking, affecting and dissolving the body, cognition, eroticism, the psyche, and the entire realm of discourse of the West. So what he's saying, 30 years ago, okay, modern artists are dissolving everything. They're breaking everything down, but now they've done everything. Everything has been broken down to emptiness. 20 years ago, art critic, as an American art critic, Donald Cuspit, quote, in the art world, such facile nihilism. Okay, that's nihilism, emptiness, no value. So that's dominating the art world, but it's facile, and that's an English word that means kind of juvenile and empty. Such facile nihilism passes for critical profundity when in fact it is simply farce. And farce is silly comedy, right? You know, it's the Three Stooges and right, silly stuff. So 20 years ago, perhaps the leading art critic is saying, it's over, it's done, it's empty, it's facile, right, and so forth. And I'm starting to feel like an old man. Over 10 years ago, when I started to write about art, I wrote, and this was my prediction, right? The world of postmodern art is a rundown hall of mirrors reflecting tiredly some innovations introduced a century ago. It is time to move on, right? Unquote. All right. So the question then is, if everybody recognizes that, okay, something happened, negative, critical, nihilistic perhaps, 100 years ago, and we basically broke everything down and destroyed it and negated everything. And by the time we get to the 1960s, we recognize that this has happened. And so it's time to move on. And then the 1970s, oh, it's time to move on. The 1980s, it's time to move on. And here we are, almost 2020, and what are we saying? It's the same thing over and over again. And is it time to move on? Well, okay, why not? Why are we stuck? Now, I want to give this as the answer, right? And to argue. Realism, that is to say, the kind of art that was rejected by the modernists when they started to break everything apart, when they started to go into abstract expressionism, right? And you go to the gallery and you look at it and you say, what is it? I don't know. And you try looking at it this way, you look at it that way, and you talk to someone who is supposed to be very smart about what's going on in art, and they say some words, right? And you're an intelligent person, and then 30 seconds later, you have no idea what that person just told you and what it is supposed to mean. So, right, why is that? And that then is to say, but notice what he is saying here. This is the guy who's the founding editor of the New Criterion, much more conservative in their orientation than I am, but nonetheless, Hilton Kramer is a very perceptive art critic for the New York Times. Realism lacks a persuasive theory. So you want to paint nature. You want to do sculptures of human beings realistically, right? We don't have a good theory about why we should do that. And the argument goes on, to lack that is to lack something crucial. You have to have a good theory, the means by which our experience of individual works is joined to our understanding of the values they signify. Now that's values, individuals, theory, realism. That is to say, the philosophy that grounds and makes possible realism has lost. And there is no such thing as a good, convincing theory to support realism. But what the moderns have and what the postmoderns have is theory. And that theory has convinced the intelligent thinkers, intellectuals, critics, and artists of their generation. So even if we can recognize that it's the same thing over and over again, and we don't necessarily like it, those of us who are not on the modernist and postmodernist side of the equation, we're defenseless in the intellectual battle. And if you don't have a good intellectual game, good theory, good philosophy, you will lose in the high art world. So why does realism lack that theory? And here again, we need to go back in time. Now this is huge. When you talk about art, right, poetry, painting, sculpture, music, literature, musical theater, right, opera, there's a huge number of genres. And what I'm going to do is cheat a little bit and just focus on one genre, literature. Because what was going on in literature, similar things were happening in poetry, in music, painting, sculpture. So I'm going to use literature as an example. I'm also going to cheat a little bit and focus just on the United States and what was going on in American literature. Now, in some sense, this is not cheating because by the time we get to the 20th century, Paris is no longer the center of everything. Artistic, instead, the action has moved across the Atlantic, and it is going to be the United States that is dominating and setting the trends in literature, in movies, in music, and various other genres, painting, sculpture, and so on. So, in order to cheat, this is the Norton Anthology of American Literature. This book sells tens of thousands of copies every year. If you go to a university in the United States or pretty much anywhere in the English-speaking world, and you take a course on literature, right, this is likely to be the book that you will read. And what it will do is excerpt all of the major authors that if you are going to become an educated person, you need to know something about these people. So you have excerpts from all of the major American authors. So what I've done is let the editors, who are all very well-regarded professors of literature, speak to who are the important authors that educated, thoughtful people need to know about? And what do they stand for, and what do they mean in their work? So, quick mark. So this is F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. Have you guys read that book? Or you've heard it? Okay, movie version, right, and so on. So, The American Dream. All right, now, it's a very optimistic portrayal of the world, but F. Scott Fitzgerald, at the beginning of the 20th century, American author, he believed it to be deceptive, proposing the satisfaction of all desire as an attainable goal and identifying desire with the material. It could only lead to dissatisfaction. Hence, the movement of all his work is toward disillusion. Now, I've pulled this quotation out. It's important. I agree with it. And I've highlighted in red the important concepts: deception, dissatisfaction, disillusion. So we take all of Fitzgerald and reduce him to those three concepts. Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled. Do you know those lines? Okay. We all learned those in high school as well. Well, what is important about Frost? Beneath the homespun folksiness of the speaker's approach, that is to say, he's kind of a out in the country, rural guy, not a fancy New York City sophisticate, is a vision characterized by bleakness. Okay, I don't know if you know that concept. That's empty, gray, brown, everything dying. Seeing the world as composed of desert places, reflecting a design to frighten and appall. Poems about winter, all right, winter is a metaphor for death, right, are more common than poems about the other seasons. And even in the spring and autumn, poems, the speaker always remembers winter. He's always thinking about death, and it's frightening and appalling. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Okay. The poem was not affirmative. Well, yes. The desperate quest for regeneration in a kaleidoscopic landscape. Kaleidoscope, kaleidoscope, right, so it's just, right, landscape of sexual disorder and spiritual desolation remains unfulfilled. I should have also done unfulfilled in red as well. So, desperation, disorder, depression, unfulfillment. The world is a kaleidoscope. Eugene O'Neill, a great playwright. Often we go to literature for understanding of human characters. Good versus evil, mixtures, heroes, blackguards, and so forth. If, however, one looks for understanding of the characters in the sense of reasons provided for their behavior. So why do people do what they do? Right? That's what we want to know. Well, one will be disappointed. So, by implication, people do what they do, and nobody has any understanding why, at least according to O'Neill. It's a mystery. O'Neill's characters could neither help nor understand what they did. The playwright presented their behavior as essentially inexplicable. That's the philosophical move there. Simply as the inevitable human condition. William Faulkner. This is about his favorite novel, The Sound and the Fury. The Sound and the Fury tells a story of grief and loss. It is in 4 sections, each with a different narrator, each supplying a different piece of the plot. 3 of the narrators are brothers: Benji, the idiot, Quentin, the suicide, and Jason, the business failure. Each of them, for different reasons, mourns the loss of their sister, Carrie. So the 4 important people here are an idiot, a suicide, a failure, and a dead person. Ernest Hemingway. He brought more to his writing than disillusionment or cynicism. I don't know, this makes me chuckle. I don't know. All right, disillusionment and cynicism. That's not enough. We need more. Right? He brought an ever vivid sense of betrayal. What is life about? How to live with pain became his theme. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. He combined naturalism with symbolist techniques to depict his characters' plights, and it expressed simple but strong responses to their sufferings. compassion, outrage, and admiration. Right? Plights, desperate circumstances that you find yourself in and you don't know how to solve your problems. Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire, the author of that, famous playwrights, mid-century, were less concerned over criticisms plays for their violence and their obsession with sexuality, which was regarded by some critics as an almost morbid preoccupation with perversion, murder, rape, drugs, incest, nymphomania. We now know that the shriller voices were attacking Williams for his homosexuality, which we must remember could not be publicly spoken of in this country until comparatively recently. So you get past the homosexuality issue, and this is the center of Tennessee Williams' writing. And this goes on. I'll just highlight loneliness, haunting people. We're driven to extreme behavior, and there's plight again. So take all of those, the ones that I highlighted before, and put them together. This is the world, the best American writers that the smart literary critics say you need to read these people. And if you want to be a significant artist yourself, you need to enter into this world, and this is your world. And it's all negative, empty, right? Desperation, death, pain, cynicism. There's not a hint of a suggestion of anything positive, redeeming, beautiful, heroic. And that is the philosophical framework within which the American artistic community, the dominant one of the 20th century, has been operating. Now the question then is, why? Right? And why perhaps in the United States of all places, right? The place of the American dream, right? Some of the richest people in the world, the freest people in the world, so much progress and opportunity that is going on, but the artistic community is totally rejecting it and looks at the world from a completely different framework. What's going on? Well, now we get all philosophical. And this is where my people, the philosophers, go to work. Because what happened then is artists are not necessarily philosophers, but they are smart people, they are sensitive people, and they do think deeply. They read original sources, they talk with other artists and other intellectuals, and they pick up on what is important and what resonates with them. So if we scale out to the broader philosophical world, what was the intellectual climate? Who are the giant names? And in fact, still the giant names in understanding where we are in the world and how we are to think about it. Well, Friedrich Nietzsche, everybody has to know something about Friedrich Nietzsche, the most important philosopher on the 20th century. His influence is everywhere. It cuts across political boundaries. You find people from all parts of the political spectrum influenced by Nietzsche. It cuts across all religious, influenced by Nietzsche. He is the deepest, most significant philosopher, and he died in 1900, so in some sense the math is perfect. But one of his famous phrases, of course, is, "God is dead." Now what he meant by that was not that there had been a God and God had died. It's metaphorical. Right? Religion has died. And religion had been part of human condition for basically forever. But think about what religion does for people and did for people. It gives them a sense that they were created, and that we are special, and that there is a God who is looking out for us and telling us what we should do. And there's ultimately justice in the world because the bad people will get their punishment, good people will get their rewards. When you die, you don't just get put in a box and rot in the earth. You go on, you have survival. But what happens then if you stop believing that? Religion is yanked away from you. You go through a crisis of faith and you can't believe in God anymore. And what Nietzsche is arguing is that's what has happened to us in the modern world. because it's very hard for us to believe those old stories that were told to mostly illiterate people in the desert 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, before anybody knew anything about science. And how are we supposed to believe all of those stories? Come on. But it's happened very fast. And we wrench out this very comforting story of the way the world works, and what are we left with? The sense that we're on our own. There is no God looking after us. We're not special. And maybe when we die, it is a cold, empty grave. And that's where we are culturally. And Nietzsche says a big part of trying to understand the end of the 19th century is how do we wrap our minds around that? So everybody reads Nietzsche. We also read Darwin. Darwin published in 1859, Origin of Species. He did not say anything in that book about human beings, but the implication is clear. Well, if we did not come from a God and we are specially created and we have an immortal soul, where did we come from? We came from animals. And how do animals operate? Well, animals operate by competition for scarce resources, and they fight, and it's brutal. The winners win, the losers lose, and it is a brutal fight for survival. And it's not nice people who survive. It is the predators. We are born of, this is not Darwin's phrase, but nature red in tooth and claw. So the red of blood is on our claws and our teeth because life is a predatory struggle among animals for survival. Now that's not what Darwin necessarily believed, but that's the philosophical interpretation many people took from Darwin's views. Karl Marx, we don't believe that there are moral standards that come from God about equality and the lion lying down with the lamb and everybody getting along in heaven. Instead, we are animals on earth, and it's about power and wealth, and it's strong versus weak, and the strong, particularly under capitalism, according to Marx, exploit their weaker people and use that wealth to control politics and further dominate. And the whole human condition then is ugly exploitation and oppression. Sigmund Freud, yes, Darwin is right. We are born of evolutionary processes, and like the other animals, we have instincts that have been bred into us. And if we are going to survive as animals, animals need to be successful as predators, and that means they need to be aggressive. They like to hunt, they like to kill, they like to tear bodies apart and devour them. And the animals that had those instincts the strongest, the aggressive instincts, particularly now think about males and how easy it is for them to fight and to like to dominate and humiliate, right, other human beings. We are ourselves aggressive predators, and we got to the top of the food chain not by, again, being nice, but by letting those instincts dominate. And of course, we have to kill and eat, but we also have to have sex and reproduce. And so those who have the strongest sex drive and combining that sex drive with aggressiveness, those are the ones that survive. So those of us who are here now, we are at the end of a chain that goes way, way back, and every single one of them was very good at killing and getting someone to go to sex, have bed with them, right? Or if they didn't want to, aggressively raping that person. And that's who we are. Sex and aggression are our dominant instincts. That's what it is to be a human being. Now the point is, if you put this, right, we have Nietzsche, Darwin, Marx, Freud. By the time we get to the 20th century, those are the big names. Everybody knows those names, and they are international names. They are setting the new philosophical framework. And then we can add science, entropy, discovered late 19th century. The idea is that there's all this energy all over the universe, but what happens is that energy flows from high concentrations to low concentrations, but once the energy is equaled out, nothing can happen. And so the prediction of this scientific theory is that there's not a God, again, organizing the whole world, and there's an ultimate happy ever after in heaven, but rather the whole universe of its energy is eventually going to spread out evenly, and the universe will just die a heat death. So, that's the world. And notice it is a philosophical world that is a early 20th century creation. And the leading architects of it, with the best arguments convincing the most intellectuals, are Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Darwin, and then some of the more pessimistic interpretations coming out of the sciences. And there's not anything positive or redeeming or progressive about that philosophical framework as I have sketched it. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with this framework. I'm saying now as an intellectual historian, that's what was going on for the smart people 100 years ago. This was your education. Now, if you then put yourself in a historian's shoes and you start living in the 20th century, you've read your Darwin and your Marx and your Nietzsche and Freud and so forth. Maybe you agree and maybe you don't. But what is actually happening in the world? It's not just philosophical theory. In the 19-teens, we have World War I breaks out, and all of the so-called civilized nations of the world are killing each other. Millions of people die, lives destroyed, maims, and we're developing new technologies better to kill each other. And the whole world goes on a frenzy of killing for 4 years. What happens 10 years later? An economic depression, horrible. This guy almost takes over the world. At the end of that, we learn about the Holocaust. And now we're into the 1940s. And then in the next decade, we're back to war again in Korea. And the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States now have nuclear weapons and missiles that can fly thousands of miles, and they have more than enough to blow each other up multiple times over. And this is the 1960s. And then we go to war again, right, in Vietnam. And you might not know this one. This is Kent State University in Ohio, a nice Midwestern university. Peaceful student protests that are going on. The governor gets a little panicky, sends in the National Guard, which is kind of a military force, and they end up shooting some students. In the streets of the United States, Detroit, Philadelphia, riots over racial issues. Unemployment at an all-time high rate, ghettos, and so forth. And so now we're up to the 1970s. And the point then is going to be, it's not just philosophy theory. It is, if you pay attention to what's going on in the world and you read the history a certain way, it's negative, 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 negative. And you're an artist. How do you capture the reality that you think and feel the world to be? Okay. Alienation from reality, from other people, from yourself. Destruction. You get so frustrated you just want to destroy and express your rage, anger, and frustration. And so it's not then, I think, accidental that the most sensitive and the most intellectual of the artists are going to be unrelievedly negative. Now this takes us back to Marcel Duchamp in 1917. And what has changed? If art then is a reflection of the way the world is, well, go back to the urinal. And think of the urinal as a urinal. What do you do with the urinal, guys? You piss on it.
I always sit down.
Well, okay. You can try that as well. Piss on it. Right? Piss on everything. It's all shit. It's all pointless. Right? And that's the mood that you have. Okay, I've got some more quotations here. I want to then put it in philosophical form. If you want to say art is about truth, that's a philosophical commitment. Well, what is the truth? And another artistic cliche is to say there's not only the content matters, but the form matters. What you create and how you present it. The what and the how, the form and the content, both are there. For your truth, what forms are going to be useful at expressing your truth? Now, if you think that the world is ugly and fractured and hideous, and that people are disgusting, even if they might look pretty sometimes, what forms are you going to use? And the argument is going to be, if the world really is ugly, nasty, alienation, empty, aggression, predation, then using those old realistic forms where we have nice colors and proportions and perspectives and everything is nice and neat and fits, that doesn't work to capture this truth. We have to break up the forms. We have to explode the forms. We have to rip off the surface prettiness to get to the ugliness and the emptiness that is really inside. And so the truth is negative and the forms have to be negative as well. So here's Jackson Pollock, the drip painting, right? So you put a huge canvas on the floor and then just various things. And he's philosophical about it. Notice what he says here. Modern art, to me, is nothing more than the expression of contemporary aims of the age that we are living in. The modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, in the old forms of the Renaissance or any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique. What were the old forms? Well, we learn in art history, right? It's about proportion and perspective, and we learn the mathematics and so forth. But those forms don't work anymore because those presuppose that the world is ordered, causal, everything fits, and so forth. We need to explode that. We need to somehow destroy all of those forms and go for the formless, what seems like chaos and randomness, and perhaps something out of that will emerge. Picasso is explicitly doing that. We look at things from one perspective according to our eyes, right? But that only gives us a partial perspective, and we are always traditionally looking for symmetry and proportion, and we want things to be beautiful. But if the truth is ugliness, fracture, disproportion, then we need to take the human face apart and re-put it together in a way that is deliberately ugly. Right? You don't want to kiss that face. And that's the point. This is a self-portrait. Offering yourself to the world. Right? Well, who are you? You're kind of stretched out, and at the same time you're exposed and vulnerable, and there's not much substance to you. Right? It's a desiccated vulnerability. And Salvador Dali, right? We take a lovely young woman, and we want to violate her and despoil her in various ways. Francis Bacon, right, what do we want to do about traditional authorities, religious authorities, political authorities, people we look up to? Well, we hate those guys for all of their corruption and their hypocrisy. And here we have one of the popes sitting on a pope-like chair, but it's also an electric chair. Right? And we just want to cause this guy to experience that. Man and woman. De Kooning did a whole series of women portraits, and they all look like this. Right? What do you think, guys? Right? Horrific. She's crazy. She's a predator. Right? She's going to bite the flesh off your body. Rauschenberg took one of the de Koonings and says, de Kooning is so great, I feel inadequate. And what do we often do when we feel that we are inferior and people who have done a lot better? Well, we hate those people and we just want to smash their stuff, right? People who are driving an old, crappy car and you're not sure it's going to start the next time, and it's a cold night and you need to get home. You go out into the parking lot and there's some guy with his new Ferrari parked there. And you hate that guy. Right? And you take your keys and you just scratch the paintwork. Hey, God, yeah, that's right. Right? So if you feel inadequate, you want to destroy, and you give into that. So what Rauschenberg did was took one of de Kooning's paintings, and he worked for hours over the course of several days to just completely obliterate it and destroy it. And the message is, it's only by destroying the past better achievements that I can somehow redeem myself and possibly become an artist. And the theorists are coming along. Now, this is a march through the 10s, 20s, 30s, and 40s of the 20th century. Formally in art history, you read the textbooks, they'll typically say around 1960, 1970, modernism is ending and we start getting into postmodernism. And so there are some variations there, but I'm not going to get into those. But you find the same thing happening philosophically. There are the modernist early 20th century movements, but by the time we get to the 60s and 70s, the postmodern philosophers are coming along, Foucault, Derrida, and I will just give you a quotation from each of them. Speaking about effacement and just destroying human faces and so forth, here's a quotation from Foucault about his writing. I can lose myself. I just pause there. Traditionally, we say when we write that I want to discover myself or find myself. And now we're in opposite. I can lose myself and appear at last to eyes I will never have to meet again. I am no doubt not the only one who writes in order to have no face. Your face, the most personal part of you, your expression of who you are to the world. And you want to destroy that. And he extends that more generally to the human species. Man is, quote, an invention of recent date that will, quote, soon be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. We're welcoming the erasing of all human faces. Derrida, about ugliness. The world is ugly. We're all monsters. And the postmoderns are the ones who are honest about it. We do not, quote, turn our eyes away when faced by the as yet unnameable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, the formless is the mark. The mute, not able to speak and express, infant, terrifying form of monstrosity. Yes, the modern and postmodern philosophical and artistic worlds are hideous, but the honest, courageous person will go into it. And he is urging that. All right, now I'm going to skip along. One more. From the same time, this is Kate Ellis, philosophical writer of the time, about postmodernism, the apolitical pessimism of both postmodernism by which creation is simply a form of defecation. Defecation, a fancy English word for taking a shit. Right? And so Manzoni, an Italian artist on the time, said, well, yes, Duchamp did the urinal. Art is something you piss on. Well, what else can we do? So he took these tins, empty, and he defecated into 30-something of them and sealed them and then offered them for sale as his work of art. Yeah, if art is something special that comes from the artist, Right? Well, what really comes from the artist? Well, yeah. All right. What are we really? All right, and one of these within the last 10 years sold for over 50,000 US dollars. Apparently they've never been opened. There's a possibility, I don't know if you'd want to open it, but there is an intellectual part of you that says, did he really? Right? And how would we know? Right? But of course, if you open it, so you might be playing a game. But the weight, there is something right to that. But the point is, everything is shit. And we want to basically spread shit over the world. Now, that's a negative portrait, but partly my purpose tonight is to try to explain the unrelieved negativity, why it has been so prominent, and to say that there are deep reasons for it, and those deep reasons are philosophical. If you read the major intellectuals of the late 1800s and early 1900s, this is the world they portray. Artists absorb it, and artists do what they do, and they find unique ways to express it in their artworks. And there is a logic to the apparent illogic. There is a sense to the apparent nonsensical nature of the art world here. Well, I want to end on a positive note the last few minutes or so. I am running a bit long, but I'm having fun, so I hope you can bear with me for a bit. There are signs in the last 10 or 15 years that things are changing, right, fairly dramatically. One sign of the change is the increased amount of humor by artists, poking fun at modern artists, or modernist artists and postmodern artists. So here's a Spanish artist, right, the model's reaction, right? So there's a lovely young woman, right, who has apparently posed for a modernist artist, right? And then finally she gets to see what he has done, and she knows that she's beautiful and lovely and young, and right, this is the reality. This is what the modernist arts, right? And who has done the better job? So it's meant to be poking fun, right, at it. We're not going to take you guys too seriously. Yeah, if that's what you want to sleep with, okay, fine, right? But the reality is much more attractive. Okay. This is the de Kooning. Represented there, and again, right, this I believe is a Cuban artist, right, a lovely young woman in somewhat classical form and classical motifs. So rebirth of the classical understanding of feminine beauty. And then what have the postmoderns been doing? Well, they've been in effect doing graffiti and defacing all things lovely and beauty, so we're turning the tables on them, and we will reject you. Another, I think I have a theme here, right? Lovely, healthy-looking young women. Right? Timothy Tyler, deconstructionist. This is a technical term within postmodern literary criticism, Jacques Derrida, and so forth. So here's his deconstructionist. And there's some interesting references here. Right? We've been in a box. We've been taking, again, healthy, lovely, real people, and we've been putting them in a box, in an artificial environment where they can't survive and flourish. So she is breaking her way out of the box. She's also not waiting for Prince Charming and the hero to come and rescue her. She is a strong, modern woman. She is going to free herself and go off and live her life. And we have some references here. MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, again in New York. There's Andy Warhol's soup can, right? And there are a few other things if you look closely. But again, we need to break out of this postmodern framework. And there also are signs that if you look at the modern artists and the postmodern artists, you would never have any sense of the astounding things that have happened over the course of the 20th century with their focus on, yes, lots of bad, negative things happened in the 20th century. But life expectancy around the world at the beginning of the 1917, I looked it up, life expectancy was 41 years. It is now 67 years. Over the course of the 20th century, there's been an increase of 25 years of life. When is that ever talked about or celebrated in modern and postmodern art? The number of people living in poverty has gone down. The number of people living under slavery has gone down. The number of children dying before they reach 1 year or 5 years has gone down. We have made astounding progress as a result of chemistry, technology, science, and so forth. And those facts need to be taken into account. And then further afield, there's a lot of sign that younger artists coming along are interested in what has made progress possible. Yes, of course, there are negative things, and art should be about the negative things as well, but it should also be informedly making a judgment call and take into account the positive things. And if you look at what's going on in biology, right, in exploration under the sea, out in astronomy and fractal mathematics, if you are at all interested and curious, the scientific worlds are opening up. Brand new parts of the world that have never been explored before. And if you are an artist and you're looking for territory and you are creative and about innovation, then go where the new discoveries are being made and become cognizant of those and see how those can inform your art. But again, that requires breaking out of this fairly narrow box at modernism and postmodernism. Some contemporary artists that I think are doing good work, Martine Lachelle, a French woman, and we start to see just in the last generation a return to the human figure. And what's interesting here is obviously a healthy, powerful male figure, but also he's an older man. And that's interesting, that you can be virile and healthy and beautiful, and if you respond to that, even sexy for a lot longer. Life is not about, by the time you're 40 or 50 years old, it's over and you just subside into nothingness. That's progress. This is a Nigerian painter, and those of you interested in light will appreciate the way he's playing with all of the light and the reflections. Of course, we have horizontal lines, but the light going vertically, and the way things are balanced and picking up and reflections and so forth. California artist, Michael Newberry, saying, the Greek myths have spoken to us for millennia, and there's a reason why we always go back to the Greeks. And here we have the Icarus legend. But what happened in the original Icarus legend? Well, he and his father, they flew up into the sky, and they got too close to the sun, and it's a tragedy. The sun melted their wax wings, and they plunged to their deaths. Well, is that the way life has to be if you are daring and inventive and willing to fly high and test your outer limits? And here we have Icarus at the end of his flight, and it's been successful, and he's landing. And of course, there's some Christian imagery, right, that's being played with here, but rather than a symbol of sacrifice and suffering and death, it's turned into success. He has succeeded in his flight. So there's a lot that we can learn not only from the sciences, but also the traditional Greek and traditional religious myths. Those are not yet exhausted. Further afield, this is an Australian artist, Peter Schipperhein. There he is for perspective, but you know, this is like a 6 foot, and he's a pretty big guy himself. This is a monumental Zarathustra. Right? Now that's an explicit Nietzsche reference, right? And there's other aspects of Nietzsche that are worth reading, not only the diagnosis of nihilism that many of the modernists and postmodernists, but Nietzsche and positive value creation and being a new creator of values, but again, on a monumental male scale. A lovely feminine figure, a young woman, right, and just the curve of her lines. This is an American sculptor in Pennsylvania. This is in a park outside of Philadelphia, and a young child, kind of somewhat balanced on her shoulder, but the child is ready to go off and explore, but still to some extent protected by and supported by his mother in this case. And that's positive. And again, returning to something that is eternal and deep in the human condition. And then further afield, a painter from Utah saying, look, artists, there are some things that we've done over and over again, But really, the world is so wide and so open, and we're just now starting to go to new worlds. And if we are willing to go to those new worlds, we will see things that have never been seen before. So, a young woman, obviously out in space, but a new perspective on the Earth. So the point is, the battle has been joined in the artistic community, but the reason we're stuck is that the philosophical and intellectual battle is now being joined, but it's still early stages. And as long as Darwin, Nietzsche, Freud, and the others are the dominant intellectuals, they are important, they need to be read, but we need other intellectuals to replace with a positive vision as well. So if you are creative, or you are sponsoring creative, or are interested in encouraging creative people, of course, have them learn their art history and their art techniques, but they also need to be, if not philosophers, at least philosophical. I don't know who the contemporary equivalents to Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, Darwin, and the others will be, but we're in the process now of sorting those out. So of course, we read Jordan Peterson and we read Steven Pinker, and that's important because they're both really smart guys. One is more conservative politically and one is more left liberal politically. That's fine. We can learn from both of them, and we will sort out who has something to offer. And the point is that both of them, in their own way, are trying to get out of the nihilism and onto something positive. And there are dozens of others out there as well. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your attention. And to the extent that Maria is the boss, says there is time, I will field questions. Thank you. Okay, should I just field them myself?
Everyone, si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta, simplemente se para y la hace. El que quiera empezar, anímese.
Yes.
Well, what you said, it seems that it's going a new light in art.
I think so.
Negative. Because I see like beautiful works by artists like Viola, James Turrell. That's art that really stays.
Yes.
But all the acronyms that you talk about, I felt exactly the same. It was, and then people is really, that sometimes they don't understand why it's so ugly, what is represent bad things or whatever. But what you're saying, what it's very interesting for me to see that the new light you're talking about.
Yes, yeah, so, yes, so some artists they don't agree with that negative worldview, and they are, in some cases, rediscovering and reworking traditional forms. But also there's been a huge amount of development in art technology, the new paints that are possible, and of course all of the new media and what computers can do for us. So people who genuinely want to do something positive they're trying. And so there are lots of new, more representational and classical and figurative schools that are opening. And there are now this is from an academic's perspective, encouraging signs that there's enough people interested that are now conferences, bringing together art critics and artists and philosophers, and in some cases vision scientists or sound scientists to talk about the new directions in art. So it could be the beginning of a new, I don't know if revolution is too strong, but at least some new directions that can compete. So, yes.
First of all, thank you for a really informative presentation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Also really convincing. But all the way through, I've been having this knowledge. I also have to explain that I do not know nothing about the history of art. But
You don't know nothing.
no, I don't know anything.
Oh, okay.
But
So you
the thing I
okay.
want to ask is that all the way through I've been thinking that it could also be something about the nature of human beings. That's the things of the art that attracts my attention is the art that provokes us. So all the philosophers you've been mentioning, their statements have always been provocative.
Yes.
And nobody cares about
Sure.
So, and I'm not also, you also started out mentioning Shakespeare. It's like 500 years ago. And his stories were also about the misery of human beings and how
Sure.
they act really badly. Platon, or the premise of his political works were that people are egoistic and horrible human beings.
Mm.
So I'm not really sure if I buy the premise that it's so distinct to our, so the last century, that the arts,
Yeah.
that influential arts have been so powerful.
Right. All right. So a few interesting things, right, in what you're saying there. No, I am not saying that art in the past was not interested in the ugly or the pessimistic or the cynical. That, I think, has always been a part of art history, and I think it should always be a part of art and art history. I think if you are an artist and you are engaging with the world and with yourself, you do have to recognize that there's good and there's bad, there's beauty and there's ugliness. So there's positive and there is negative. And if you are aware only of one side or the other, then I think you are, right, partly blind. And I think part of then of being an artist is like being a philosopher, being like a human being, is engaging with the world as it really is. Now, there's a follow-up question, though. Say there is, say, beauty and there is ugliness. There's good and there is bad. Which is the most important? And which do I want to work toward furthering? So there's two additional value judgments that you have to make. So what you can say is, I think the world is, say, equally balanced in good and bad right now. And that's a descriptive claim. But then, do I want to just, through my contributions to the world, maintain the equal balance of the good and the bad? Now, if you then make a judgment call that says, yes, I do, then what you're saying is, I really don't make much of a difference to the world. The world is just going to carry on equally good, equally bad, independently of my efforts. So you're making already, at that point, a philosophical claim about yourself. And if you take yourself as a representative human being, you can generalize that to say human beings can't make a difference to the way the world is. But if you then say, I think the world right now is equally balanced between good and bad, but I want to make the world a better place. And so what I want to do is emphasize the good, whatever I think the good is. And in my art, emphasize the good. Then you're also making a philosophical statement about yourself. You're saying, I think I have some competence, that I can make a difference in the world. And I'm saying that to me, I think the good is more important than the bad. Yes, there is the bad, but I'm going to prioritize the good over the bad. And that says something about your moral character. The same, I think, would go the other way. If you say, yeah, there's good in the world, but I'm not going to focus on the good. I'm going to use my agency and my power to spread more ugliness and negativity in the world. And what I want to do is use my power to create something that is provocative, right? But the provocative direction I want to go is to make you have in your life more negativity. Okay? And that also then is a philosophical claim about our social relations. I want to make your life more negative. That's what I want to do. And that's a philosophical claim. Now, the point about, you had a lot packed into your question there. So maybe I will come back, but the word provocative, I can come back to that if we have some time, because there's another interesting set of issues there. So go ahead.
Thank you, because I really appreciate.
Sure, thank you, my pleasure.
It was awesome. I like your ideas. The other day, I was talking with a French friend, because in Paris there's Duchamp, the exposition. So we just talking about that, and he told me, oh, Bacon is house and blah blah blah. And don't you think? And I say, it's kind of creepy for me, but okay, I agree. And I have a prejudice.
Prejudice?
Yes, before coming, about also ugly. I think I was thinking about
Postmodernity?
Yes, like something ugly also, but I think I have to, I discovered with you two things. First, ugly is not necessarily bad. Ugly is a condition of humanity, and I think when I saw all the pictures and you talking, it was I discovered to myself that yes, of course. I mean, if we try with art and with everything that human are perfect or we are beauty, I think it's also healthy to break down everything and say no, we're not perfect. So I think that part of the story is really necessary to rebuild something in which we are. So I really appreciate your vision. I don't know if your idea, but at the end I saw that you show the new vision, and it's not I don't know, it's not bad. I mean, when you broke something, you can build something. So
Okay.
it's good.
Yeah, that's nicely said. Sometimes I think about literature examples. So suppose you think about literature that works. And so Shakespeare and Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo and Rand and so on. The literature that works is not only positive, beautiful characters. So at one level, if the literature is going to be successful, it has to have an understanding of the actual human condition, which is very complicated. So there's good and bad, beautiful and ugly, young and old, living and dying, and so on. And the great works, the epic ones, they have everything in them. And that's an important part of it. So if it's too one-sided, then we start to say this is too fantasy. This is not realistic. Because partly what we want is for the art to engage us philosophically, because we're all grappling with our own lives. And however good or bad our lives are, they are also mixed. And we're trying to sort out the mixture and make decisions in our own lives about what I can improve and what I can't improve, and what my short-term goals and long-term goals are going to be. So that has to be reflected in the literature. So you will have good characters and bad characters. You have honest and dishonest, just and unjust, beautiful and ugly. And we're trying to sort out all of these. But then at the same time, the artist does, the literary artist, need to make an overall judgment. And is it just that I'm portraying this is the way the world is and I just leave it at that? Or am I going to be optimistic and emphasize one side over the other? So yes, I don't know, take a detective story. So somebody gets killed, and then the detective comes in. And in a good detective story, there's lots of very different sorts of people, and most of the time they have some good and they have some bad, and they have different kinds of motivations, and we learn a lot about human motivations and human types and all of the rivalries and so forth. But by the time we get to the end of the detective story, the author has to make a decision. Is the detective going to find out who the killer is or not? And that's a philosophical decision. And some detective stories, they will say, the detective fails. And that's a philosophical statement. We will never ultimately figure out the bad. And the bad people will get away with doing bad stuff. And the good ultimately are impotent. But of course, if you go the other way and you say the detective figures it out, Miss Marple, Agatha Christie, or whatever your detective is, she figures out. And that then is to say it's a moral lesson as well. The bad people, yes, they exist. And all of the people in her stories are mixtures of good and bad. But the important thing is the bad guys get caught. Justice is done, and we celebrate the fact that human beings like Miss Marple are very intelligent. and they can figure that out. So you do have to have some philosophical skin in the game. You have to make your commitments if you're going to be successful in art. So, yes. Oh, sorry. Am I out of order?
Oh, okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, for example, there's another battle about art that I was very interested on your opinion. About Martin Scorsese and his comments on Marvel entertainment.
Oh, yes. I saw something going through my Facebook feed, but I don't remember what it was.
Basically, Martin Scorsese, he said that Marvel movies weren't art, and I wanted to relate it to this, because, for example, movies like Marvel, the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and all the movies that they show each year.
Can I just interrupt? Just give me an example. Is this Iron Man?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so that's a Marvel guy.
Like Star Wars and movies like that, like blockbusters like Jurassic Park and Avatar and so on and so forth. Well, how do they fit into this category of postmodernism, and how do they get out of that? Because, for example, comments about, for example, Mark Hamill, who is the actor who portrays Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, he talks about the industry of escapism and how does that fit into this panorama about art in the postmodern world. What is escapism for people and for families, and how does that connect to the human in all of us?
Yes. Well, another rich set of observations, right, in a question. So we have Martin Scorsese's initial claim that Marvel comics and the movies are not actually works of art. Now, I don't know what his reasons for those are, but my initial reaction would be to say he's wrong. They are a form of art. They are a fictional representation, right, of characters. They have characters in conflict. There's plot, and there's resolution, and there's a moral of the story. So I think it's art. Now, he might be then making a shorthand claim that they're art, but they're low art, or they're just not good art. But absent knowing what his reasons are for saying they're not art, I can't comment on that, unfortunately. But the other part then is escapism. And that was the other big concept in the second part of your point. And I guess I would first ask, well, what do you mean by escapism? And sometimes that's used as a pejorative or as a negative of saying what happens when you go into art is you leave the world behind and you go to a pretend reality. But by calling it escapist, it sounds like you're saying, I'm not saying you, but the people who use this concept, that you shouldn't do that. You should always stay in the real world, and art is not real, it's just make-believe, and so it's childish and unreal. Now, if that is what is meant by escapist, then I would say it's the wrong concept to use when you're talking about art. Because precisely what art is meant to be, in some cases, an abstraction on and a creation of alternative possible worlds. And that's precisely its positive values. One of the wonderful and important things about human beings is that our cognitive apparatus is aware of reality, but we can also disengage from reality and consider in our imaginations, theories, and other possibilities in order to learn about the world and about ourselves. The way the philosopher Karl Popper put it, as he said, this is the most important thing about human beings is that we can let our theories die in our place. So that is to say, we precisely can come up with imagined alternatives and imagined worlds and figure out which ones work and which ones don't work. And then the ones that don't work, don't try those ones. Whereas animals who are not able to do that, they just have to live in the real world, and if they make a mistake, then they die, so to speak, as a result of it. So the point is that escapism, we need a positive concept for that to capture the genuine value of considering alternative realities that are made up. So, with that clarification, am I being fair to your question?
I think yes. I wanted to add something about escapism, because escapism does have those sort of two positions, like negative and the positive one.
Yes.
And the positive one being, like you said, about escaping from the reality that we are part today, because it's sadly, because we are indifferent to it, and we have to go to that other place. So that's why I wanted to like intertwine it with the postmodern approach to art.
Yeah.
And you have the necessity to escape from the ugliness of the world.
Okay.
Instead of working inside it.
Yeah. So let me say, right, it is possible, of course, that you are in a bad situation in your life. And so one value of art can be that you are just fighting hard to get through your life for 12 hours a day. And what art can then do is give you an escape, and so it's like you go on a vacation for 1 hour, music, a novel, a movie, and it refreshes you psychologically just by the break, because you forget all of the negative, and then you wake up the next day and you are refreshed and you are able to fight again. So I would then say art as escapism for that kind of person in that life situation is enormously valuable. And there are millions of people who report that that is exactly what it has done for them. But also, if you are in a negative situation, what art can do is help you break your concentration with the world that you are living in, because it dominates your consciousness, and give you a sense that there are other possibilities. I can be in a terrible situation. I'm living in the south side of Chicago, surrounded by gangs, and people are being shot. But I can read a story, right, about people living in Japan doing something or other, creating video games, and I'm a young person. And that inspires me, and I realize there is another world. It doesn't have to be like south side of Chicago for me. And then I can not just get through the day, but then I can say, all right, I'm going to somehow get out of south side Chicago, and I'm going to go to Japan, right? Or I'm going to go to Hollywood, and so forth. But I would say art is more universal than that. But even if your life is going well and beautiful, you have a beautiful family and you love your work and you have a lovely home, we still respond to art because we are curious about the rest of the human condition. We're interested in what's possible 100 years from now, so we read science fiction and so forth. And so art enlarges our sense of possibilities and gives us a sense of maybe all of these things that I'm doing right now are great and wonderful, but there's something I never considered before, and maybe I should pursue that other positive value as well.
You talked about the ugly. I want to just
yeah, I think I'll have to come back just because, yeah, there'll be some other, okay, at the back, Gabrielle.
You talked about the philosophy behind modern and postmodern art.
Yes.
And something else I noticed about people who admire modern and postmodern art, that there's also some type of pretentiousness and sense of superiority in claiming to admire that type of art. And I wanted to know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, I think we know from all walks of life that some people are interested in achieving something, right? And they have their own independent judgment about what counts as accomplishment, and they want to themselves accomplish something and, of course, then be respected socially based on their accomplishments. And there are other people who want that recognition from other people, but they don't want to earn it or work for it. And so they learn the games to play in order to get counterfeit honors and so forth. So the art world is not unique in that regard. So you find that in all walks of life. You'll find people who are pretending to be more spiritual than they are to gain religious kudos, or to be richer than they are to get into the right country club or whatever. So the art world is a world that some people enjoy, and so they want to have status. And then there's always then the question, are you going to be a genuine artist or a genuine art critic, and so earn your status, or are you going to find ways of playing games? Now, one of the ways in which modernism and postmodernism help a certain sort of person is that it is deliberately obscure and often deliberately playing around with meaninglessness. And so if you have some gift of verbiage, playing around with words, then yes, you can play social games with other people. You can make it sound like you know what you are talking about, and that person, they're naive, they don't understand what you are saying, but they're going to say, oh, he sounds like he knows what he's talking about, the fault is mine, and so you'll get an indirect boost of prestige. So the point is then that in contrast to non-postmodern forms of art, where you have to say, here is my theme, and you're trying to make it clear, and here are the techniques that I use, and you can explain what those are. And so their clarity and communication is a premium. If your philosophy is anti-clarity and anti-communication, it does open the door to all sorts of hangers-on as well. So I would say the art world is more populated by that sort of people now than it was in other eras. Okay. Yes? Oh, I am sorry. I'm sorry.
There is this new trend in children's literature.
A trend in children's literature.
They're changing they consider the classics too even too harsh.
Classics are too harsh.
Yeah, too evil. The characters are that's what this guy does. So they're changing the plots and the characters. Lovely. And I find it, I reject that kind of change. But
Yes.
for example, the tin soldier, originally he's pushed out of the window by an evil envious toy.
Yes.
Now he slips. The minute
Ah.
victim in the story.
So it's an accident, it's not a murder. Okay. Yes.
You lost the plot, you lost
Yeah.
the plot.
So the question is about children's stories and classic children's stories. Oh, there's two questions then. Okay, good.
Positive or negative to change the plot of the
Yes.
story and make it more lovelier.
Yes. So, yeah, I was going to repeat the question. Yes. So the question is about classic literature, classic children's literature, and when you look at it, a certain amount of it is very harsh. So the first question is a question that we would each ask as parents and teachers of young children: which classic literatures, they're classics and we're all supposed to know them, do we judge are still appropriate for our children to learn, and at what age? And I would say that there's no straight answer to that, that it's going to be a judgment call by every parent. And it's going to be for your children, and it's not going to be they're 6 years old so they can handle it, because not all 6-year-olds are the same. So it's going to necessarily be an individual judgment call by parents and teachers for each of their children. So I remember, for example, with my daughter when she was young, thinking, oh, the Grimm fairy tales, right, from the Brothers Grimm and all of the classics and so on. I'm going to read her these stories. So I bought them and I read them. I said, no, I'm not going to, right? Because they're really nasty, right, and horrible. And that then leads to the second part, right, of your question. What about the phenomenon then of taking the classic stories and revising them in a kinder, gentler, right, nicer way? Yes, that's right. And then I would say that you should not do that. Right? I think what you should do is write your own story, and just have a different version of the story. Change the names of the characters, and change the outcomes as well. So other people's artistic creations, don't change them. That's theirs. Right. That's right. That's right. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. I have time.
5 minutes?
Okay.
Okay. I was wondering, what is your opinion on, this, on Catalan, the banana, say,
Oh yeah. Yes. So that was Art Basel Miami or just Art Basel Switzerland? Which one was that? It was Miami, okay. Yeah.
Sold in $100,000, and then a performer came.
This is for Gabrielle,
yes,
right?
related to-
That's right. Ooh, I bought the $100,000 banana with. I think it's the Dutch tape that's really worth about $90,000. The banana's only $10,000, right? So.
There are a lot of issues related to this that's so much. Is it art? Is it not art? What is more important is all the discussion around.
Yes, that's right.
Right, of course.
Yes.
And so, what is your opinion on?
Yeah. No, that's yeah. In that one in particular, I just again saw that floating through my Facebook feed, so I didn't follow up. But there are thousands of variations on that every year that are going on. At a certain point, you say, "Oh my goodness!" Right? I've already said. Okay, so this time it's a banana. Okay. Great. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. So who cares, right? Does it matter that it's a banana as opposed to what if it was a rutabaga or a watermelon, right? So it was Dutch tape, right? Would it matter if it was painter's tape, right? You say, no, it doesn't really matter. So it's just it's a gesture. But I think the thing you were saying toward the end is what's more interesting is the discussion about the work rather than the work. And that's one of the very interesting things about modern art and postmodern art in general, because almost no one buys those works in order to enjoy them as works of art. Instead, they buy the work because they want to have a big debate and discussion about them, which is to say, the work is almost just a symbol for a set of ideas. And of course, this is part of what conceptual art is all about, that the actual object doesn't matter. It's all about ideas. And then the whole point of the work of art just is to generate a certain kind of discussion. So in this case, we would say, well, this is meant to be a discussion for people who are already in the art club, right? The kind of people that...
Well, that's what Tom Wolfe notes in his book.
The painted word, yes, that's right. So it's, in one sense, it's deliberately exclusionary, right? We want to make sure that 99% of all human beings have no idea what's going on here, because we are part of the 1%, and we understand that this is a banana. And 2 years ago, there was this guy in Zurich, and he did something with a carrot, right? And so it was, and it wasn't on the wall; it was on the ceiling, right? And so we're having a discussion, and it's among us. And what we then get is the sense that we're in a club, and we're excluding, right, other people. And then the person who pays the $100,000, right, or whatever, that's someone who really wants to be in the club. And they've got $100,000 to burn, so please let me into the club, right, and so forth. Right? But of course, the people who are the art critics and the other artists, right, they might let that person into the club, but they're really going to laugh at that person. Like, what an idiot, right? Yeah, he's a pretentious, right, hanger-on and so on. So. I lost track of the order.
If we are not in postmodernism anymore, where are we?
Yes. I don't think there's a we, and I think that's the hard part, because I think right now what we have is a large number of subcultures. So there's a long-standing divide between high art culture and popular culture. So the kinds of movies that come out of Hollywood and that 99% of the population enjoys, and the kinds of movies that are, I don't know, this is an overstatement, right? The French existentialist movie where everybody mopes around for 2 hours and then commits suicide, right? So we've seen that movie 30 times, right? Right? But the 1%, right, say, oh, that's really deep, right, and so forth. But the 99% who like Hollywood movies, they hate that. So there's a huge, right, cultural divide there as well. But then at the same time, within, if we just stick with the movies, right, there are people who love the romances and the actions and the westerns and the detective stories and so on. And some people like science fiction, and some people like oldies, and some people like new movies. So I don't think that we have right now a universal art culture anymore. I think particularly now that we are global, we have hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of niches. The interesting thing, though, for me, though, as a philosopher, is who gets the stamp of approval by the professors of art, by the philosophers who study art, what foundations have the $500 million endowments so that they can do grants to artists, so they're the ones who have the power, and what art critics are writing for the New York Times and so forth. So what is going on there, because that is a decisive culture shifter, and that's the terrain that I am working on. So I think high art culture is still largely postmodern, but I think nobody believes the postmodernism anymore. I think 20 years ago when I started writing about art, you find museum directors and art critics, they still believed in postmodernism, but I think they don't believe, they just, it's part of their salaries to write about this stuff. They have their reputations are based on it. Or I have been working at this museum for 15 years and now I'm the assistant to the main curator of the museum, and so I'm on a career path. And the only way I'm going to become the main museum director is if I continue on this path, because already on the board, the people who write the $1 million checks every year, right, and they're writing the $1 million checks because they want to be in the club, but they don't necessarily believe in it anymore. So to some extent, it's a self-perpetuating culture, but it's still important culturally. And they're not going to change until better ideas replace the existing ideas. I think they are open to it. The rest of the culture definitely is open to it, but the philosophy needs to come along compellingly. So we have to stop there, you say? Okay. Thank you. Really good question.